Welcome back to TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought.
Hey Phil, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Well, pretty good. It's been a while since we've done this, but we're back.
That we are. What book are we going over again?
So we're going to finish up. Well, no, we're going to continue with Sigurd Grindheim's Christology and the Synoptic Gospels. So, and I think we are on chapter 3, where he's talking about the image of Jesus, Matthew's image of Jesus. So,
all right, and remind me, why is this book important again?
Well, it's so one of the things that skeptics, non-believers often say is that there's a development in Christology over in the early church. In other words, and what that means is what the thinking is regarding Jesus and who he was. And so the argument goes that Jesus himself didn't conceive of himself as divine or anything like that, right? That's a later development in as a result of the early church. And so the argument goes that the last written canonical gospel, that's John. John has a very clear picture of Jesus as a divine person, and the Jesus in John's gospel is he has a divine self-image, right? Where he says explicitly in John, I and the Father are one, for example, and he makes very clear statements about himself. And so the argument goes that that's not the same is not the case in the synoptics being Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so Grindheim is looking at the synoptics to see exactly how they are portrayed by the gospel writers in those gospels.
Right, and so far we've talked about Mark.
We're talking about Mark.
And so today we jump into Matthew.
And right.
Luke.
Yeah, right.
Yep. All right. Well, what'd you read?
Well, so in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is Matthew depicts, or the writer of Matthew depicts kind of an ambiguous picture of Jesus, and actually the same thing is true about Luke. In that is, in some cases, some instances, some locations in the gospel, Matthew appears as in the role of God, and in other places he appears in as God's servant. So it's kind of both of those together that appear in Matthew. So
and it's those, two kind of ideas that, this is where it gets kind of tricky.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why some people don't think that Jesus thought of himself as God.
Right. Yeah.
Or, like that. So yeah, well, kind of the breakdown. John the Baptist is messenger for the Lord, forerunner to Jesus.
Yep. And that's interesting because it seems that Matthew is sort of setting a stage there in some sense by his in the third chapter his depiction of this interaction between John the Baptist and Jesus, and in there it's clear that Matthew depicts John the Baptist as a forerunner to Jesus. And what's interesting about that is John is also identified later in the book, Matthew, with Elijah, right? Mm-hmm. And so coming after Elijah, Jesus is takes the role of Jesus's ministry is sort of like God's, well, here's a big word, God's eschatological presence. So eschatological means like end time. So right, mm-hmm. so Elijah is a forerunner to sort of the day of the Lord which is
end time, END, end time.
ENT. Yeah. What did I say?
I don't know. It sounded like you said end time.
Oh no.
Just wanted to make sure everyone's clear.
Yeah, end time. The
Eschatology.
eschaton, right? The end of time, end of days. And so Elijah's a forerunner to that, and so Jesus' ministry then is eschatological. In other words, it has to do with the end times and the presence of God at the end of times, basically. So we sort of start out like that, and we see that in Matthew we see that eschatological image of Jesus. He shows up as a judge, eschatological judge at the end of times. And here we see, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man in Matthew often. And
what's important about that title again?
Well, so there's some debate about what it means, and I think honestly it has several different meanings to it. Son of Man really can refer to a human being, right? In some contexts, it can also refer to sort of an image in Daniel, where we have the Son of Man coming, which is sort of a divine figure, and Jesus uses it in kind of all of those terms, I think. Mm-hmm. And we see that we do see that in Matthew, where he talks about how the Son of Man will come and judge, collect his own and judge, and those who are not his own, are burned in the fire. Which is an echo of Old Testament prophecy in Zephaniah. He talks about how the Son of Man will repay people for what they've done, and the Son of Man coming in glory. That's clearly references or an allusion to passages in Zechariah 14. Also in there we see Daniel 7, the Son of Man, and so Jesus is clearly alluding to that. Now what's interesting about that is, from a Christological point of view, Jesus is, when he calls himself Son of Man coming in glory, he's clearly referring to the image of the Son of Man in Daniel. Mm-hmm. But in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus replaces the Ancient of Days. So in Daniel we have the Ancient of Days, which is clearly a reference to God, and Jesus is using that reference. I mean, he places himself in the place of Ancient of Days, which he's equating himself to God there in that context. So in those senses, Matthew clearly portrays Jesus in the place of God as this judge at the end of time. Mm-hmm. And then there are other areas where Jesus refers to himself, or I should say Matthew depicts Jesus in the place of God. So
so Jesus, of course, his favorite title for himself was Son of Man.
Son of Man, yeah,
right. So in Matthew, so that Matthew 13. 40 through 42, yep. 43 or so.
Right.
So, so starting at 41, the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness.
Right.
And will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Yep.
And I think this is, it's pretty clear. The Son of Man, Jesus, his favorite title, referring to himself here, puts himself in the place of the judge at the end. And of course the big idea in Christianity is, in the end, we all stand in judgment.
Yeah. Well, and that's clearly, as Grindheim says, an allusion to Zephaniah, the first chapter, talking about, God coming, where God talks, mm-hmm. and says that he will come and he'll sweep away man and beast and fish of the sea and all this, caused, all the idols that cause the wicked to stumble and such. So what he's saying is that Jesus is when he's saying that he will come and he will judge. He's putting himself in the place of God.
Yeah, and I see this. I think is a big deal. So this is why I've never really understood the argument that like Jesus, like this was a later development in the church, that Jesus didn't actually believe that he was God, and no one believed that he was God. This was something that the later church did.
Right.
Like this is, it's never made sense to me.
Well, and I can see that, and I think it doesn't make sense. But I think what people who say that are saying is, John, it's very explicit. I and the Father are one, for example, right?
Right.
But I think if you look at Matthew and Mark, and then as we'll see Luke, it's not so explicit, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Also, if you consider, the audience, I mean, anybody raised in that Jewish environment would have at the time understood Jesus when he's making these allusions about himself. He's making pretty radical claims about himself.
And I think a lot of this probably wouldn't be such an issue. So you would think that they would just simply say, explicitly, Jesus is God.
Yeah.
And make it much more clear, then there really wouldn't be any debate about it, and that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's where, they're coming from.
So explain that again.
Well, so it's like, if they would just explicitly say in the Gospels, Jesus is God. This is God. He has come down as man.
Yeah.
And you don't see that explicitly.
Right.
So I guess the question comes, why didn't they just say that?
Yeah.
But clearly later on, in the creeds and in the early church, hundreds of years later, it's a very explicit statement.
Right.
That you just don't see early on. And I think maybe that's where this idea of it developed over time has come from.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, in a sense, right, the creeds, the doctrines get developed over time, right?
Yes.
But that's only because the church leaders are responding to other beliefs, right, that perhaps didn't exist earlier. So early on, but in the earliest Gospels, in other words, the Synoptics, it's clear that Jesus has an image of himself that is elevated and on a par with God. We see that, as we just talked about. And there are other areas too in Matthew, right? He does the role of God. He takes the role of God in many places. He forgives sins. Mm-hmm. He applies Scripture to himself that's originally for God, applied to God. We see that in the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, this sort of thing. So, if you're in that environment, that would be a clear, elevation of Jesus on a par with God.
Well, and of course, what he's accused of too. It's very clear.
Right.
So I don't seem to.
There was one thing, if I can bring this up real quick. There was one thing that I hadn't noticed before, that Grindheim talks about in Matthew, where Jesus elevates himself above the law. Mm-hmm. Not just the statements in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, but I say. That's one.
Right.
And he points out that we know of no Second Temple era scribe that would refer to his own authority, right? It was always, it's said. But one thing I didn't realize was, if you remember the story where he tells the young man that says, "Hey, I want to come follow you, but I got my dad, I want to bury my father first."
Yeah. And
Jesus says, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." And what Grindheim says, and this actually originates with Martin Hengel, who's another New Testament historical Jesus scholar, says that was the burial of the parents was considered one of the highest requirements in Judaism at the time. And we can see that it's taken originally from Genesis 55, but there are numerous references in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the earliest Jewish law. It predates the Talmud. Mm-hmm. And also in the Talmud as well. But so what Jesus is saying when he said, "Come follow me and let the dead bury their own dead," he's elevating himself above the highest legal requirement for the Jew. So, in any case, that's an example I had never recognized or seen before, where Jesus is putting himself on par or above the law, and the law originated with God. So it's indirect, but it's very clear that Jesus had a very elevated self-image in Matthew.
So yeah, I've never heard that example either, but I had already gotten that idea but you had referenced the Sermon on the Mount, which I always thought that was really clear. It's like, you have heard it said this way, but I say,
right.
And it's like, this is like as much authority as you can have.
Yeah,
this
right.
This is God's law,
right.
and he is sitting here giving the next set of commandments, elevating that law.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think we're about out of time.
Already?
We are.
Okay.
We got a few minutes left, but should probably go ahead and try to close it out.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess when we come back, we'll discuss what Grindheim has to say about Christology and Luke.
Sounds good to me.
All
Have
right.
a good one.
See ya.
Thank you for watching TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought. Be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Make sure to follow us over on our social medias. Links in the description. Thanks for watching.